Okay, in today's lesson there's some information that we've covered. One of them is that colour was used to represent things in the Shakespearean theatre. We need to look into to what degree that was important, and there are some interesting things about that. For a start, one of the things that was mentioned today was that if stage black was hung on the stage, then the audience expected a tragedy, although later on, with the introduction of tragicomedies, it seems that colour then they ceased to indicate what type of play it was with colour. But we need to look into that information and see something more about that. We touched upon the fact that there was high status clothing, but we need to explore what that would actually have looked like in Shakespeare's lifetime. We spent some time going through some of the issues relating to performing in Garrick's lifetime. So, for instance, in his production of Macbeth, several things. First of all, he had the confidence to turn his back on the audience, and that was something that we noticed that they did a fair amount in the production that we saw. And the question is, this was a big thing that Garrick did. This was not something that was common in the 18th century. Was it common in the 17th century? Now, we looked at the fact that the Elizabethan stage is considered to be three-dimensional experience because the audience sort of wrap around the whole thing. It's a proscenium stage that comes out into the audience, and the audience are all around it in the boxes on the stage as well. So Garrick, if he'd been performing on the Globe stage, it wouldn't have been as easy for him to turn his back on the audience without some of the audience still being able to see him from the front, probably. But did Shakespearean performers do that? Was this an innovation that Garrick introduced in the 18th century, and then it's worked its way through into the 21st century with us now? We need to know what it was like in 1599. Garrick was conscious of creating stage pictures. So we've got here somebody who's got an idea about the overall view of what the stage looked like, and he was an actor manager. And if you like, there are several different stages. During Shakespeare's lifetime, I've kind of nominally called that period the age of the writer, because that's when the living writer was there, where the work was being put on, and we must assume had some role maybe in creating something specifically for an audience, and so therefore they had some input on it. We suspect that maybe Shakespeare had some input in the way it looked or came over. We need to look for evidence of whether or not it was him that did it or somebody else, or whether there was none. But certainly Garrick had an idea of what he wanted to see on the stage. He was looking at creating stage pictures. If we look at our 21st century performance, we can totally see that actually the person who is directing this has got a very keen eye to what it looks like. Much less of an understanding of how it should be acted, but certainly a very, very clear understanding of what they wanted to see and what they wanted the audience to see. In some productions in Garrick's lifetime, there were bare candlelit stages, and I suppose that means that just you saw the actors in their costumes, and that was pretty much it. One of the things also to remember about the lighting of the theatre in the 18th century is that when they came to the front of the stage, they could be seen fairly clearly because it was lit by candlelight. But as soon as they started to move towards the back of the stage, they did become almost invisible, depending on how far back they went, because the lighting only went so far. I mean, candles don't throw out a huge light. Torches don't throw out a huge light. So the stages were very, very dark, except for the very, very front. So there is an implication there that a lot of the acting in the 18th century would have been at the front. Well, in Shakespeare's lifetime, we've got this proscenium arch that comes out into the audience, and in addition to that, it's performed during daylight. So it's going to be interesting to see what you come up with in terms of, well, how would it have actually looked? Where would they have stood? How would they have acted? Our question is, we go into the theatre, what does it look like? How do the actors act? And how does that relate to what we've just seen? Cuts. We've talked about in the 18th century, we know that texts were heavily cut, and in fact there were interpolations, so other dialogue was put in. Well, the Macbeth that we saw was significantly cut, and I am pretty sure that they had interpolated other dialogue into it that wasn't there in the first place, because there were a few things that I didn't recognise. Not a lot, but there were a few things I didn't recognise. And it looks like the text was updated slightly, and what we try and do is find out whether or not there was an attempt to update Shakespeare. Now, they didn't try to update Shakespeare in that sense in Garrick's lifetime, but they cut the death of Lady Macduff and her children in the 18th century. Well, they killed Lady Macbeth in our production, but they didn't show us the children being killed, which is always a very emotional part. They killed Macbeth on stage in the 18th century, but apparently during the 18th century that was not traditional. Was it traditional in the 17th century in Shakespeare's theatre? We need to look at that. The colour palette at the Young Vic was very muted for the most part. There's a lot of grey, blue, that sort of nude colour of the witches, which is... it doesn't really stand out massively, although it does stand out against the grey to a certain degree, but pink against grey, it's fairly relaxed. It's sort of pastel-y, isn't it? And there was white on the actual floor of the stage itself. But the colour palette was restricted mostly. We've got Malcolm, who's got this very, very sort of standout gold T-shirt, and we've got Duncan in a white suit that really stands out. The majority of the rest of the performers were fairly muted. The two dancers had more colour on them, but again, it didn't stand out to the same degree that Malcolm and Duncan did. Clothing, we need to look at that in terms of how status was conveyed and what it would have actually physically looked like. Now, we know now that the name for the scripts that actors got in Shakespeare's lifetime was foul papers, and a foul paper is just your cues and then the words that your character speaks. Your job now is to find out what are the drawbacks or benefits of that. How does that affect acting? How does that affect the quality of the acting? What was the colour palette in Shakespeare's lifetime? The costume in Shakespeare's lifetime reflected the styles and fashions of the period. Well, so did the performance that we've just seen. So we've got a similarity with the 21st century Macbeth and the 17th century Macbeth in that they would have reflected that. But I think there would have been differences. Now, the Macbeth in our production did wear a gold crown, but it was almost like a gold crown that you'd get out of a Christmas cracker, wasn't it? It wasn't really lavish or beautiful, but it was symbolic, I suppose. Would they have worn a crown during Shakespeare's lifetime? Interaction was a huge element of the Shakespearean theatre in the 17th century, and there was no interaction in the production that we have just seen. There's a difference in dynamic there. There's a difference in the way that an audience appreciates a play in Shakespeare's lifetime and nowadays. We need to look at that. We need to look at why that is and how that came about. Because there was a shift from Shakespeare's day to the 21st century. There's been a total shift in terms of the way that the audience responds to the theatre. And one of the things that we heard was that Andrew Gurr says that the audience in Shakespeare's lifetime felt like a crowd, not an assembly of individuals. So, if booing started, then the whole house would be booing. If there was laughter or applause at any point, then the whole house would laugh and applause. Today, people tend to react individually to certain bits. They will laugh or applaud if they specifically think it's funny, but they won't necessarily copy other people just because they're doing it. Who had the whole script? Because we know that we had the foul paper for all the actors. Who had the whole script? Who directed? And how was direction created? You know, what was the difference between the direction of the Shakespeare play in the 17th century and now?